Hello and welcome to the show. You are on the Cheap Mama Life podcast, and I am your Cheap Mama, Brenda Kilhofer, and I am so excited today to have our guest, Forrest Rivers, on the show. Forrest is the author of COVID-19 and Humanity's Spiritual Awakening. Unity and compassion are on the rise as the result of the worldwide pandemic. Without diving into too much, I am going to go ahead and have Forrest introduce himself and share with us, where that all came from.
Sure. How you doing? Thank you so much, Brenda, for having me on the show today. Excited to be with you and your listeners. And I wrote this book, COVID-19 and Humanity's Spiritual Awakening, as a way to kind of inspire hope during a admittedly dark time for many. And I started writing it back in March when we all went on the lockdown of last year. Like a lot of people, was feeling a lot of fear and anxiety and uncertainty and all the things that we now associate with that year that has been. And I wanted to kind of provide a more hopeful and inspiring narrative. Like, if this is going to have to happen, how can we use this for our own growth and empowerment and awakening? And as the pandemic was unfolding throughout 2020, I noticed that as I was writing, I wrote about the theme of awakening from a whole bunch of different perspectives on how we could use this for our own positive transformation. So it was part like therapy for me to make sense of what was happening. But I also wrote this with the intent to maybe uplift and inspire others, um, you know, to look at the light that could come out of the darkness. And it was just meant to be a positive counter narrative to everything that we've been hearing about, which, I don't want to downplay the suffering. The suffering that people have gone through is very real and very dramatic. But I wanted to kind of offer, here's a way that we can actually use this in a positive manner. And it tied directly in. I've been long writing kind of more self-help articles for some publications, and I've been teaching meditation for a while now, and I figured it would be a good time to deliver this message.
Awesome. I love the first thing that you had said is just an opportunity to inspire hope. I mean, I think hope for me is one of those things that the world needs, and I can remember, not during the COVID necessarily, but I can remember from 2008, another period of time that is well marked, my family feeling so hopeless. And yet, just like this period that we've just gone through, there are folks, to your point, that have terrible tragedies, terrible loss, and there are also others that make a choice to take that situation or any period of circumstances and create something absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
So
and that's what I wanted to focus on. Yeah.
So step me through. What do you tell us in your writing, and what are some of the key points that we should take away from this interview today?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think everybody can relate to that I talk about in the book is that the last year was an important period to find added meaning in our lives. What actually matters. I can't tell you how many people I spoke to, and I talk about many specific examples in the book where people were home and having to, whether they were home um, working virtually or they were on unemployment when their jobs were cut
Mhm.
due to the lockdowns, so many people were exploring what brings meaning into their lives. And you heard of numerous stories of people, and I knew many people, including myself, who took up new forms of art and creative expression, who use this time to re-examine what they want to be doing with their lives. Do I want to be, you know, working that 9 to 5 office job that isn't really bringing me any kind of true happiness and joy? Or do I want to focus on something else that's a little bit more inspiring? Like, for example, my friend Alex,
Mhm.
he lives down in Charleston, South Carolina, and he's been working an office job that doesn't bring him a lot of fulfillment. And he took up woodworking during the last year. And um, now he wants to transition to being a full-time woodworker
Oh,
because it brings him
awesome.
passion and a sense of purpose. And so there were a lot of examples like that where I think people were re-questioning what brings purpose and meaning into their lives. And, you know, kind of closely tied to that, to the
Right.
whole the meaning idea, I think more people have been examining how can I do something with my life that'll contribute to the uplift of all others too. Not just make
Right.
me money, but
Right.
help people. Like, for example, Brenda, you're doing this podcast.
Right.
The podcast will inspire people and contribute to that kind of uplift that I'm talking about. So
Yeah, I hope so.
yeah,
Anyway,
no, I,
that's
I think so. I know so, and I think so. So I think that kind of awakening or
right.
realization came out because think about it. I mean, before the pandemic, we were so everything's just go go go,
Right.
quick quick quick, consume consume consume, and then finally all that stops for a second, and we have to be with ourselves and our thoughts, and we have
Mhm.
to question meaning. So I think that's one really big positive that came out of this. Now, I'm not saying that everybody took advantage of that. That's a big
Right.
caveat I want to say, is that not everybody took that from this. And many people probably will just go back as we're opening up now and as things
Right.
are returning to normal, whatever that means. We're seeing a lot of people going back to their old ways. But I think there's also a substantial amount of people who were internally changed
Mhm.
by this and are realizing, hey, I want to do something a little bit different. Um,
So
another, yeah,
do you think to your point, so there's a couple ways to look at. I mean, my daughter right now, she's 16, she's trying to get a job and she can't get a job anywhere because all of the applicants are aged 16 to 18 and they want some adults to take these to at least manage and supervise these kids in the jobs that would traditionally have been teenage jobs, and they can't get the adults to take those jobs. I know a lot of folks would say, well, that's simply because, they're more comfortable on unemployment. But do you think that perhaps it's not really just that? And it's to your point, what you said, that, hey, there's more to my life than going and
yes,
working for the big boss man, and I can
100%.
create and contribute to my family better in this way, to all of these different things. Is that
Oh, I think, Brenda, that's
yeah,
unquestionably one of the factors why we're seeing this labor shortage.
right,
Are there some people out there who are kind of coasting off the unemployment? Sure. But guess what? The government's not paying that much, right? It's
right.
not that much in unemployment, which doesn't get covered that much in the news. The
Mhm.
big thing, I think, is people have gotten a taste of some time off to
Right.
realize what I really want to be doing in my life. And as you said, the prospects of going back and working for the boss man aren't that tantalizing when you could be pursuing something that's more passionate and brings more meaning and sense of fulfillment. So I think that's a really important facet
Right.
that's happening right now, for
Well,
sure.
and
And
of
I
course, even if they are coasting off of unemployment, many of them are doing so simply because, hey, the relationship in my home that I now get to enjoy,
is
that
more
I didn't
important.
get to enjoy before, is more important. And as long as my needs are met,
Yep.
then I, then I'm good with it.
Absolutely. And I would point out too, Brenda, that just because you might be on the unemployment that you're not doing incredibly meaningful
Right.
things with that time. So, for example, in the book, I talk about how two of my a good friend of mine back in Colorado, him and his wife, who have been working their butts off
Mm-hmm.
for the last 10 years nonstop around the clock, decided just to go move off the grid. They took a
Mm.
lot of their savings, they got a nice RV, and they moved to Utah and they're living off the grid. I have
Wow.
another person I talked about who took his savings, his little savings he had, and went
Mm-hmm.
on the Appalachian Trail, which is not far from where I live now in the mountains. And he went off and decided to hike the entire thing as a way to bring a sense of purpose to himself. So,
Right.
I think that's a big thing that's come out of this. And if you were a little intentional, this year could have added a lot to your life. Now,
Right.
besides that, just the meaning part, other important aspects for our growth that have come out of COVID is is that many people have had to face down their fear of death. And
Mm.
it's a tough topic. It's a tough
Right.
topic to bring up with many people because clearly, um, even some of your listeners may have known somebody who
Right.
died from COVID very sadly, or people who are struggling to even recover from
Mm.
COVID, or people who lost businesses, whatever it might be. It could be a real death, or it could be the symbolic death, like
Right.
just
Right.
losing your job or your business. So I think what came out of this was the need to face fear over your own mortality, the need to face the idea that you may suddenly be forced to change, right? Your position where you're at.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it's a reminder that death is always there. It's a reminder of our own mortality. And I think out of that, there's two ways to approach that. One is to react to that the last year with fear,
Mm-hmm.
paranoia, and anxiety, which, if that's where you are, that's where you are, and that's part of your path. But another way that you can react to that is with the sense that, okay, death is in our faces. Wherever we look, it's in the news. We're hearing about it. How do I meet this moment now?
Mm-hmm.
And one way to do that is to live this life, to realize that, hey, you know, tomorrow's not promised. So I better live today with an added sense of purpose and with meaning. And
Mm-hmm.
I think for a lot of people, that came out of this period. And I think
Yeah.
that search for meaning and the contemplation of one's own mortality are directly linked together. And that definitely profoundly, I think, came out of this period as well. And I talk about that a lot in the book,
Perfect.
how even the mystics, if you look at any faith, whether we're talking about
Right.
Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, the mystical aspects,
Mm-hmm.
even Islam, the Sufis, the mystic aspect, the mystics of every faith talk about that if you want to be able to live your life fully in this moment, you need to come to terms with death. That death is one of those most powerful forces of
Right.
spiritual change.
Yeah, and I think you brought up the fear piece, and I think just even judging by my own experience, I think the vast majority of people experienced fear. You know, for some, maybe it was just momentarily, and they shifted, and like you did right away in March, shifted if you had any fear or whatever. But many very quickly shifted into use it, the other direction, and stepped into courage maybe to
Yeah,
use that time. And others, it took time to even recognize that that was what was going on for them, right? There
absolutely.
was almost, they call it the COVID coma. There was almost like this paralysis, this like
Yeah.
what is going on, um before one could recognize. So if somebody's still in that space, does your book address that, and what do you recommend that they do if they
Yeah.
recognize that that's where they're at?
Yeah. So if you find yourself still stuck or found yourself for a very long time stuck, in that kind of fear mentality,
Mhm.
the first thing I talk about in the book is to say, hey, that's the first start. That's an
Right.
incredible place to begin. Don't knock yourself. In the book, I talk about this. Don't knock yourself. Don't be hard on yourself. Meet that with compassion. The fact that you're aware that you have all this fear is a tremendous step in itself,
Right.
because there was a great quote. It was from I think it was the uh, philosopher I'm pronouncing his name wrong, but it basically goes like this. It says you can't you can't uh, you can't escape from prison unless you realize that you are already
Right.
unfree in it. You can't be free until you acknowledge that you're in prison first.
Right.
So you can't escape the fear unless you acknowledge you're first feeling that fear. So
Right.
in the book, I say that's the first step.
Yeah.
Second step is to find coping strategies that can help you manage that fear. And one of the most powerful, time rooted, ancient practices that can help you with that is meditation.
Mm.
And I highly recommend meditation to the listeners. There's, and that's one thing I talk a lot about in the book is the value of meditation practice for helping you release that fear,
Right.
acknowledge it, and transcend it. The other thing I talk about that can maybe help you with the fear is spending more time in nature,
Mm.
spending more time in the natural world. Because the more time you spend in nature, whether it's
Right.
swimming, whether it's hiking, whether it's even outside gardening, it releases so much of that negativity and our
Yeah.
attachments to fear and change. Because the more that you're in nature, the more you realize that nature itself, that which we're a part of, we
Hmm.
forget that a lot, that we're a
Right.
part of, is a natural cycle. And
Right.
that natural cycle is birth, decay,
Hmm.
or maybe you could say this more positively. It's birth, the coming into its own, the decay, the death,
Hmm.
and then the rebirth.
Right.
And it continues that cycle over and over again. The more time you spend in nature, the more you become comfortable with all of the metaphorical
Right.
seasons of your
Right.
life because you see yourself reflected in it.
Yeah.
So
Awesome.
those are
And
those are two those are two big things I talk about to help you with that fear. And the last thing, creative expression. You know, that fear that you feel within you, it needs an expression. It needs an
mhm.
outlet to be released. And sometimes you find that during the most tumultuous moments in our years,
Right.
whether it's during times of war, think like World War II or the
Hmm.
Great Depression,
Hmm.
the 1960s, which were filled with turmoil and conflict, comes comes really profound creative expression to meet that fear in that moment.
Right. I love the nature part. And I think that was something that, whether it was self inflicted or whether it was due to closures, many, many people did not have any connection whatsoever to nature. They were stuck in their apartments or stuck in their homes, and not going anywhere out of, whether it be fear or whether simply some of the parks and stuff. I know here many of the parks were absolutely closed to the public. I mean, I know I was super grateful and super blessed, and we live on a little bit of a tiny hobby farm, so my life is nature, at least on the property.
Yep.
I'm out in it daily, whether it's with the horses or the chickens or the cows or
Sure. That's amazing.
yeah. Yeah. And yet others, and I remember that was something throughout it I was super grateful for, because we had literally just moved to the property in 2009, in September 2019, and I just remember thinking, man, like, I can't imagine being cooped up in our other house. I mean, I'm in the middle of Phoenix, well, suburb of Phoenix, in the hot sun, with just our little backyard and swimming pool versus all that, the kids,
Farm.
you
Yeah.
know, and then, having this to go explore, these, new things to learn where the animals were concerned while school was out or they were stuck online all day. So that's
Yeah.
incredible. Well, let's take a super quick break. We went through
Sure.
through a lot. That now those were the three key points, or were there others that we can catch when we
Yeah.
get back? Or
Yeah. I was, so yeah, basically coping strategies for that fear were, was meditation practice,
okay.
finding some kind of outlet with nature, and then creative expression. Yeah.
Awesome. So those are some great coping strategies. And after we get done our break, we'll come back and we will share some more. So,
Fantastic.
all right, here we go.
Hello, good people out there in podcast world, cyber world. Interrupt your programming real quickly to tell you about our sponsor, Medium Lauren Robbins. Medium Lauren Robbins, if you look at someone who's warm, loving, genuine, and has a welcoming energy, like talking to a friend, Lauren is the one to talk to. She's direct. She will tell you what you need to know, not what you want to hear, and will comfort you when you cry or when you are upset, like a good friend would. If you are a new client, she will make you understand what you requested before you even start the session or service. Visit MediumLaurenRobbins.com for sessions and services. Get hooked up with an endorsed medium today.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. I'm Brenda Kilhofer, your cheap mama, and I am here with Forrest Rivers, who is the, brainchild author of an incredible book, COVID-19 and Humanity's Spiritual Awakening. And I'm so impressed because Forrest, literally, as he shared in the first half, right away in March, recognized that there was something he could do to contribute to what the world at large was facing as the pandemic hit and all of the different things that hit. Now, you talk about how unity and compassion are on the rise as a result of that. Share a little bit about that and how your story outlines and addresses that. That would be awesome.
Yeah. So on the surface, if you're only, I want to put this caveat out there. If you're locked into the news,
Mm.
you all you saw was division. Whether it
Ah,
was everything with the election to your views on the
right,
masks to
right,
the Black Lives Matters to the Capitol Hill riots to the conflicts about vaccines, all that. So on the
right.
surface, if you were only tuned into the news, all you heard was division and fear,
Mm-hmm.
all of that.
Right.
But if you tuned below, you kind of tuned yourself a little bit away from the news and you tuned in to yourself a little bit, into your soul, into your heart space, you realize that there's another narrative happening. And that was that people, whether they wanted to acknowledge it or not, were becoming more aware that they are interconnected. They are tied together as one.
Mm.
It's inescapable. I mean, whether you had, you couldn't write COVID off as something that was just, oh, it's happening in India or it's happening
Right.
in Italy. It was happening in India. It was happening in Italy. It was happening in America. It was happening in Brazil. It was happening in every country around the world. So just that alone, the acknowledgement that
Mm.
we all suffered is really actually pretty profound. I mean, when have we been through a collective point where one thing has brought us together in our suffering?
Right. Not.
Maybe World War II was the last time we had that kind of collective event where the whole world felt
Mhm.
that. Um, and I would argue that out of that acknowledgement of suffering, even if we're still distracting ourselves with all of these social and political divisions, the seeds
Right.
have been germinated to
Hmm.
eventually grow into greater awareness of our sense of connectedness. Now, how did this translate into real world examples? Well, you heard, you heard sprinkles of positive news in
Right.
amidst all that jungle of division, which by the way is emphasized more because it sells, right? It
Absolutely.
sells.
Absolutely.
It's part of our consumer culture. It sells. But
Yeah.
sprinkling beneath all that negativity, you heard inspiring stories of
Hmm.
doctors who were financially set, who had no reason to come out of retirement other than
Hmm.
service. You nurses who did the same thing, who had their retirement accounts, who could have just walked away and been
Right.
like, just brushed their hands off and been like, I'm so glad I'm done and I'm not returning. And they
Mhm.
came back when hospitals were facing shortages. I think that's pretty darn inspiring. I saw that my sister who works in the ER firsthand witnessed many doctors coming out of retirement to help out in the shortage when California, where she works, was facing a major hospital crunch with COVID in the initial days of the pandemic. That's pretty inspiring. You
Oh,
heard
I,
Kate.
I mean, just even, I mean, I remember seeing different, groups, community groups on Facebook, where somebody's like, hey, I'm at the grocery store. They
Yep.
have toilet paper. Does anybody need it? I'll bring you some,
Here's a wonderful example. So,
strangers.
oh, so there were numerous examples of that, right, Brenda, where people were
Yeah.
forming community groups
Hmm.
to basically help people who were shut in or
Right.
isolated get key necessities for free. It was a
Right.
volunteer effort.
Hmm.
I heard cases of spiritual centers or uh, the more forward-thinking, conscious churches.
Hmm.
I say that with who decided that in the amidst the pandemic, we'll switch to
Hmm.
virtual sessions to keep
Right.
everybody engaged and not
Hmm.
feeling alienated. While the demand for food banks rose to unprecedented heights, so did the amount of volunteers who
Right.
volunteered to help out at these food banks. I met two. I had numerous students in my virtual classes who were working on food bank drives to
Wow.
meet the demand during the time. You heard examples of nonprofits who saw an explosion in funding
Mhm.
to help with the homelessness issues that
Okay. Yeah.
that cities were facing during the crisis and how to keep the homeless populations safe from the pandemic.
Yeah.
When when
Even restaurants and coffee shops. Like we had a local coffee shop here. I mean,
Yeah,
nobody's coming into their store. They're literally in this space of, oh my gosh, I'm gonna lose my business. And yet they're making coffee, lattes and coffees and just
to
taking them to
help
the
out their
hospital,
communities.
taking them to the hospital for the frontline workers and stuff. Just
Super,
incredible stuff.
just incredible stuff. So I
Yeah.
mean, like, why weren't those stories? And they were, if you knew where to look.
Yeah.
But why weren't those stories told more in the mainstream press? Because they don't sell as much, right? It's not.
Right.
It doesn't meet that sales model. But those are examples. Everything we just brought up,
Hmm.
where you can see that growing awareness of our interconnectedness. We've all suffered together, and the
Right.
small acts. This is key for the listeners. Small acts of kindness builds up to really monumental shifts in consciousness.
Right.
And I think that came out of this period. I hope
Mhm.
that we carry that forward and the lessons from that moving as we transition into that new normal.
Now, Forrest, as you talk about a shift in consciousness, tell the audience what you mean by that. What do you mean by a shift in consciousness, and how do you see this shift that we've just had carrying forward? And what can we do to ensure that we not just carry it forward, but that we grow it?
Absolutely. So like consciousness, in the way I understand consciousness, it's our state of awareness. It's our what do we identify our thoughts and our heart with?
Mm.
And for far too long, our state of consciousness has been rooted in what I would just say is the ego. What can I get for me? Anything outside of me doesn't really matter. What I do to others, what I do to the earth really has no bearing as long as I benefit, right? well, clearly we see the we see the very severe consequences of that kind of mindset, whether it's poverty, extreme poverty, or whether it's what we just talked about a second ago, the plight faced by homeless populations, whether it's even during the height of the pandemic, getting each other sick, that's a very basic form of it. Extending out further, deforestation, the devastation we cause to the earth, the effects we're seeing with climate change, all of all of the sixth mass extinction of species. That ego mindset clearly is not the way forward. And I think what COVID has done, it's not the only event that's done this, but it's shifting our awareness just a bit from an ego state of awareness to what might be called a more spirited or unified sense of awareness, that we are interconnected. We are all part of a greater and mysterious web of being. Call it absolute being, call it God, call it Tao. It has many names.
Right.
Everybody has a different name for it. Or part of something that is intricately tied. We are not, what I'm trying to say is we are not separate entities. We are individual beings. Yes, there's Forrest and there's Brenda and there's various billions of beings on this planet, but we are also connected together in a strand of awareness. We're all connected. I mean, quantum physics, our most advanced and forward-thinking scientists in the field of quantum physics has even proved that everything in the universe is interconnected and vibrates. And I think we're transitioning from that phase of consciousness where we only see ourselves as separate to a consciousness that sees everything as interconnected and as whole, as one. And, COVID isn't the magic bullet that it's going to send us into that consciousness, but it's one of many light posts on the transition to that deeper, what I would call a more spiritual awareness.
Right. I love that you share that with quantum physics. It's been one of my, my history comes from doing satellite communications and wideband radio in the military.
Oh,
so,
wow. Okay.
As I've, really gotten into self-development and growing myself and, understanding just books like Think and Grow Rich and different things where they talk about law of attraction and, the different frequencies and things like that, it called me to, I remember explaining in a lecture one time that our brain is like a physical multiplexer, that that we're sending these signals back and forth. And I remember thinking like, how can we discount that truth when the radios and the satellites and all of those exist? I mean, without having some sort of example of how frequency travels, how would Marconi or any of them ever been able to come up with it? So I love that we are, that you share that, because I think that is just so key. And to your point, regardless of what anybody defines that connection as, and that source of connection, just a recognition that, we are, I mean, as humans, I often say we're applying what our insides feel to somebody else's outsides versus looking at it and saying, you know what, they're human and they have many of the same feelings and same experiences it may be that I do.
Yeah. And I think that's beautifully said, Brendan. I think that's the kind of shift I'm talking about, that where you see that where our awareness is transitioning from that ego separateness to that connected, unified, that connected frequency, to use that phrase.
Right. I love it. So, let's see, I'm trying to think what else, so you gave the 3 coping mechanisms, You talked about the circumstances, the consciousness. Is there anything else that the potential reader should know? Why, why grab Forrest's book? Where, what?
Yeah. So I think more than anything, I think people would relate to this book,
Yeah.
not only because we've all been through these experiences together.
Yeah.
I think there'd be a point of relatability that all your listeners will identify with.
Right.
But I think deep down, we all know that the old way, that ego consciousness I'm describing, is not working for us. It's
Right.
just simply not. And this period we went through this last year and change could be an opportunity to sort of reset and re-inspire, or better way, reimagine, or imagine a better way of moving forward. So I think in this book, there is a message of hope for a dominant narrative that wants us to be afraid, and that wants us to wants us to just accept the fact that things probably won't get better and won't change. And my book strongly counters that, to say, no, like, COVID happened. It was meant to happen. It was part of our collective destiny. Call it part of our collective karma. It had to happen to be able to shift us into a more positive, loving, unified consciousness. So I would say that to people, that this book will help you put COVID in proper context that hasn't, how about this, a higher or deeper context that maybe the mainstream press has ignored altogether.
So do you address that? Do you address that in the book, that there is a definitely a dominant narrative? And do you discuss maybe some of the possibilities as far as why that narrative? Because I remember you talking about that whole press side of it being so different than what the underlying experiences were that we didn't get to see. And I was somebody who had completely unplugged from the press prior to, and it was when I plugged back in because I wanted to know what was going on, I found it so interesting. Like, I felt on some level that I was in the twilight zone, right?
Yeah, that's how I've heard a lot of people describe it exactly that way, Brenda.
Yeah, there was this story if you listen to these stations, and there was this story. In fact, I remember because for the most part, I had been unplugged from all media for years. But there were a couple TV shows that before I unplugged that I watched, and I still watched. I remember one coming on, and I said to a friend, I said, wow, isn't that interesting how, they're displaying Seattle as this, happy, wonderful, this culture that's celebrating all of their, the firemen and all of this. And that's so far from what happened. I remember her going, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, didn't you see the things on that whole autonomous zone and everything and what was going on and how they wouldn't even let them in? And she's like, no, what are you talking about? And it was that moment that I was like, okay, am I just living in the twilight zone? And there are two completely different
fractured realities.
Yeah, it was
that's what
crazy.
It was. Yeah.
And is that by design, do you feel? And
absolutely.
Does this book help us overcome that and understand how that is?
I mean, in the book, I just basically talk about how, simply put, the powers that be it government, media, capitalist elites, they don't want us to unify. Right. They don't want us to take a deeper perspective, because that's just not in their pockets interests, and as a part in the book, I don't go into great detail, but I talk about how the media purposely kept us
Mhm.
divided and played off of our conflicts and our divisions, when the truth of the matter is we are far more connected. We are not our political labels.
Right.
That's a big point I make in the book. We're not conservative. We're not liberal. Before we're conservative, before we're liberal, before we're black, before we're white, before we're everything, all these divisions, isms, we are fundamentally spiritual beings who have taken birth in these bodies for a purpose. And the earth is a training ground for our souls, for whatever you want to call it, our essence, our being, to evolve. And when you can adopt that perspective, then everybody becomes your brother and sister. The earth becomes your refuge and your true home. And how could we hurt each other and our own planet?
Right.
You know,
I love it. I sure, right back to the very beginning theme, the hope. I truly, truly hope that as we awaken from COVID, as we begin to move through that, lessons like yours, that those voices that have rose during COVID will continue to resonate throughout the world and reverberate at a much higher frequency than our media and those that are in control do. And because to your point, I feel like they continue to spread division, and they continue to look for any such topic that they can divide us on, whether it's to wear a mask or not to wear a mask, or to teach this in our schools or not to teach this in our schools. Or
I hope it leads to building off what you're saying, but I hope it leads to a total re-examination of all of the precepts that our society's built upon. And not only we can't have, and I want to make this really important point, we can't have collective change, until we have individuals shifting their consciousness, which comes to what? Individuals becoming empowered and working on themselves. I have always believed that change comes from you first,
right?
And then you become a light unto others, and that's how change isn't made. And I know they've been valuable throughout time. I'm not discounting protest movements and all of that. Right. But the real change comes from within you that then spreads out. And that's how, and I hope that we all, number one, look at the lessons that we each individually learned, and then we come together and we compare in notes. Right. Hey, what was your experience with that search for meaning? Oh, this is what I found. What did you find with your overcoming fear? Oh, this is what I found. And I hope we have a giant sharing of all of the lessons we took from this period, and we share them. And as we put this whole period behind us, we just grow in our awareness and we truly begin to evolve.
Right.
And more than likely, COVID, I'll say this actually even differently, not more than likely, definitely going to happen. COVID's not going to be the last event that will shift our consciousness. It'll be, maybe in 5 years, we'll be talking about, oh gosh, like climate change is more imminent than we ever thought. And climate change may lead to the same, I'm just bringing an example,
right?
That may lead to the same kind of self-examination that COVID did. Right. So
I love what your point. Stephen Covey says it best: is your circle of concern versus your circle of influence, right? We get to address our circle of concern, what goes on in first with ourselves.
Yes.
When we can lead and manage ourselves at a higher level, then we can do the same with our children, our families, and move out into the communities.
That's how change is made. I mean, think about it. I mean, if you raise, if you become conscious and centered yourself, and you become in that spiritual consciousness, and then you raise kids and they become business people. Well, guess what? Those business people aren't going to suddenly be like, well, wait a minute, maybe I should destroy the earth to make my profit. They're going to figure out ways to be sustainable while earning their living. and there's examples of that. I mean, there are socially conscious businesses, that exist out there. There's wonderful examples of conscious individuals who apply just that type of thinking,
Right.
and so that's how change is made. You got to get your own self in order. From there, you can get your house in order. And once your house is in order, your community can get in order. Once your community is ordered, then you can get your state in order, and it builds up. It doesn't come from the top down. It comes from the bottom up. That's what I've always thought.
Absolutely. And you know what? And it's so cool because one of the things that, I mean, like you and I are right here, we're on Zoom today. We didn't know each other before this. And I mean, that not only did that interconnection, yes, to your point, has always been there. And yet COVID was able to bring all of us right into one another's living rooms, one another's, screens, different networking events. And as I feel like there were so many people to your point. I mean, you get this, I'm part of a community where we are creating a business that gets this,
Yes.
I just met a gentleman the other day who's creating, different ways of decentralization and things like that to lift control. He had ideas, and that's where and it's given us the ability to collaborate and come together versus all of us working in these independent silos, because we are more interconnected. We are reaching out and becoming not just spiritually connected, but actually being able to meet face to face, have conversations, and spread our message in such a way that we reach more people, which is absolutely, I mean, I love what you're doing. And
so what we're seeing right now is, if you really want to break it down, we're seeing, and I don't think historians will know what to call this down the road, but we're seeing a consciousness, a revolution in consciousness. And I'm not really sure that, like I said, historians will understand that or even be able to put a label on it.
Right.
But I think if you still your mind enough and open your heart enough, you can start to feel that that's actually happening right now.
Right. I think we're shifting out of this information age where we're so overwhelmed with information, and we're trying to sort out what's right or wrong, to start to say, all right, the only way it's what resonates right, or not even right or wrong, what resonates is serving me, or truth, or, versus just, okay, this was what I was always told, and this is how it's, I know for me, I've certainly explored deeper and deeper into, my own belief system. So I love that you've put together such a thought-provoking manuscript that, can take, like, to your point, something everybody relates to, and help them maybe take it that next step if they haven't already, or at least understand the path that maybe they've started on. And we'll see it through to completion. We'll see, not just, oh, okay, my job opened back up, let me go back to work and go back into that. I mean, it's a coma too, for all intents and purposes.
Back into the rat race.
Yeah.
Do I want to go back into that rat race? Do I really want to be that rat running around my maze anymore? Yeah. Or do I want to break free from that maze and do something that brings not only more meaning to myself, but spreads positivity to others as well?
Yeah. Because ultimately, I feel like all of our needs will always be met, regardless of what choices.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's already happening. Right. I mean, and I would also point out that maybe COVID taught us that there's a big difference between our needs and our wants.
Right.
And that maybe the wants are things that we can cut out, that craving, and really simplify our lives.
Absolutely. Well, Forrest, thank you so much for being here today. Tell the audience how they get in touch with you. How do they get a copy of your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can reach me, contact me at forestrivers.com. So FORREST rivers.com. And the book is available on Amazon. You can just go online. It's in a Kindle edition, and it's also in paperback edition. And feel free to go pick up a copy. And what else? If you buy a copy and leave a review, like a detailed review of the book, I will go ahead and send you a free copy of my first book, The Hippie Revival and Collected Writings. Just simply contact me on forestrivers.com. I have a little contact form. Awesome. Give me your, it'll go to my email, and we'll go from there. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here today. I really enjoyed our time together. Hope maybe we can have you back on the show another time, talk about hippie revival. And this was certainly an enjoyable show. And for all of you listeners out there, just like and subscribe, download, and make sure that you're notified of every new episode. So thank you again, and have a wonderful week.
Yeah. Thank you, Brenda.
You bet.
Hope you enjoyed that episode of the Cheap Mama Life podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review right now if you haven't already, and hit that share button. Until next time.